helpful suggestion at the break that maybe I could give you a little bit of like a few minutes, 5 minutes or so, at the end of the session to actually sit and discuss this now, because the minute you leave here today, life is going to hit, and you're not going to take the time to sit and talk unless you're a very disciplined person. So I'll see if I can do that. Maybe at the end, give you a chance if you're here with your spouse and you want to take time to talk for a few minutes. I'll try to incorporate that in if I can. But let's look at session number 2. I don't know if it's right side up or upside down on your notes, but either way. Another, as the introduction says, another significant part of the marriage relationship where there are expectations is with regard to roles and responsibilities. And one of the reasons we have expectations in this regard is certainly we just carry them into our relationship, but I also think we gain some expectations in this area just through what we hear in our culture and what's put in front of us, that a husband's going to act a certain way and fulfill certain responsibilities, a wife is going to fulfill certain responsibilities. And so I want to suggest that regardless of where our expectations come from and what our expectations are, we need once again to align our expectations with God's expectations in these areas. And I'll just tell you right up front, from my standpoint, as I've talked with people in marriage situations for a long time, this is probably the one topic that's the hardest pill to swallow, because there are some things in here that go counterculture for sure and go down sideways because they're not completely understood. And so I'll just say right up front that as we go through this and we remind ourselves of what our biblical responsibilities are, I'm not suggesting these are easy, nor am I suggesting that many of us have actually seen this lived out in the way that God intended it to be lived out. There's no question that Bible verses with regard to roles and responsibilities have been used in abusive and wrong ways, and so I'm going to try to present this in a biblical fashion and encourage you to use it in the way that God intended it to be used. So, what does God expect of you regarding your role and your responsibility in your marriage relationship? Well, let's start with the husbands in the room, or the men, the future husbands. What does God want with regard to the husband? As it says there in your notes, the husband is designated by God as the head of the wife. And just say that in our world, and that'll spin some heads, literally and figuratively. All right? Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. I want to be clear about this. I put this there in your notes, and to me this is fundamentally important when it comes to our understanding of biblical roles. Regardless of what your role is, your value in the relationship is the same. Roles have nothing to do with value, all right? So this is not a designation of value, nor is it a designation of importance. It is a designation of function. In its context, the word head here in Ephesians chapter 5 refers to a position of leadership that is shaped by sacrificial service, not absolute authority. Now, I understand when we hear that word head, we can have all kinds of distorted views of what that means. I am not talking about heavy-handed authoritativeness, and that's not what God is talking about here. He is talking about sacrificial service. So as the head of the home, the Bible teaches that the husband has three primary responsibilities. Men, I've made this very simple for you. All of them start with the letter L. Okay, so 3 L's should be easy to remember. The first one is this: the husband is called by God to love. I find verse 25 of Ephesians chapter 5 to be one of the most challenging and most convicting verses in the Bible on the subject of, well, really on any subject, honestly, but certainly on the subject of marriage. Husbands, love your wives as what? As Christ loved the church. Take that statement and chew on that for a while. Love your wife as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, so that she might be holy and without blemish. Then it says in verse 28, in the same way, husbands should love their wives as they do their own bodies. When my middle son was getting married a couple of years ago, I spent some time over FaceTime, Zoom with him, reading through a marriage book called Gospel-Shaped Marriage. And we were having a conversation about this passage. And I said to my son, I think the most challenging and convicting statement of that passage is, love your wives as Christ loved the church. He said, actually, for me, the one that's most difficult is love my wife as I love my own body. I'm like, that's interesting. I never thought about that before. But he looked at that and said, I think that's the harder one. Interesting. So they're both difficult. So guys, when it says husbands love your wives, you got a tall task in front of you. So husbands are commanded, as it says in your notes next to point number 1 there, is commanded to love their wives in the same way that Jesus loved his church. So how do we describe that kind of love? Well, there are 3 New Testament words for love. I say agape. Most people here, I think, say agape. Agape love, philos love, and eros love. While all 3 uses have importance, agape is the focus of Ephesians 5:25. Agape love is almost always in the form of a verb, indicating that love is first and foremost a choice rather than a feeling. I personally think that's significant. Most of the time in the New Testament, love is in the form of a verb, not a noun. That means you have a choice about whether you're going to love another person or not. It's a decision of the will. Agape love is the kind of love that acts selflessly to meet the needs of the one loved. It's the kind of love that acts first, not waiting for the loved one to initiate love. And it's the kind of love that acts consistently, not waiting for the loved one to reciprocate love. So the husband's agape love is going to be demonstrated through practical deeds that demonstrate that he is placing his wife's needs above his own. And so, husbands, in the room, for your own consideration at some point, I would encourage you to think about this. What kinds of practical actions show love? And to help you answer that, in an informed way, I would encourage you to ask your wife how she understands love. Because your idea of a practical way to show love and your wife's idea of practical way to show love might be very different, right? There's a book that I've spoken of from time to time with people called the 5 love languages. I'm sure some of you have heard that. I personally think there are some dangers associated with the 5 love language concept. However, I think there are some helpful things about it, and one of them is that it is true that we all receive love differently. There are things that are more important to you, that speak to you as something that's loving, that may be different than another person. For instance, I think one of the 5 love languages is words of affirmation. One of them is gift giving. One of them is time. So for instance, I think we've discussed this before. I hope I get this right, or else I should probably just sit down and let somebody else come finish this seminar. I think my wife's primary love language is time spent. I was afraid to look at her. Did I get it right? Did I remember? Okay. What's that? Yeah, she likes gifts too. But I personally would tend to be inclined to do something for my wife before I would to spend time. It's just how I'm wired. I'm a doer. I just go do it. And so I might think that I'm helping my wife by doing things around the house. And I'm showing her love because I'm cleaning up the dishes and I'm getting the vacuum cleaner out and I'm doing all these things that I think are very helpful. When all she wants to do is go to the beach. Well, I hate the beach, so to go to the beach is a huge act of love on my part. But she'd rather go to the beach, and I'd rather do. So if all I ever do is do, and I don't spend time with her, then I'm not really speaking her language, so to speak, of love. And so I think it's important to understand the other person's love language and show love in practical ways that the other person really receives it that way. So husbands, think about that, talk about that. What are the practical ways that you can show love to your wife? First command, husbands called by God to love. Second L, husbands called by God to learn. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they're heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. So the husband, as it says there in your notes, is commanded to live with his wife in an understanding way. Another translation says to dwell with her according to knowledge. This involves being aware of and considerate of the needs, the desires, the likes, the dislikes of his wife. And as we learn, we are to show them honor, just as God does. This is one of those other verses that show us that roles in marriage have nothing to do with value, that we are on equal plane, right? Because he says, show honor to the woman as a weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life. Equal plane, heirs with you of the grace of life. And so to show honor is to place them as a special object of love and care. And we do this because God takes this very seriously, doesn't he? I think the end of verse 7 is very significant. He says, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as a weaker vessel, since they're heirs with you of the grace of life, so that, what? Your prayers may not be hindered. God takes this verse very seriously. to the point where he suggests that your communication with him is interrupted if you're not dwelling with your wife in an understanding way. The need for this command is driven by an obvious but important reality. I don't know if you noticed this before, but men and women are different. I was in a meeting. I think Alex was in this meeting too. Was it last week or the week before? We were in a meeting, and some guys started joking around a little bit about marrying cross-culturally. And so one guy said that, he was joking about an American marrying a South African, and the challenges that created, and somebody else joked around about a South African marrying a Canadian. And I said, well, I'm a man, my wife's a woman, I marry cross-culturally. And you gotta think about that for a second. Everybody laughs. You guys didn't laugh so much. Think about that for a second. It is cross-cultural to have a man and a woman together. We're from two completely different planets sometimes, right? So we're very, very different. That's not bad. That's on purpose. God designed it to be that way. So the reason I have to learn about my wife is because I don't instinctively understand her. Not that she's hard to understand. Well, sometimes maybe, but she's not hard to understand. I just don't think like her. I'm not wired like her. So I have to learn how she functions, how she thinks, how she operates, what's important to her. So a husband needs to continue to learn and discover what the differences are, and this is significant, this is hard, to appreciate difference rather than criticize difference. We have this natural tendency to want people to be more like us. God didn't make my wife like me, and that's not a bad thing, it's a good thing. And one of the differences described in 1 Peter 3 verse 7 is that women are the weaker vessels. Say that in public and see how well that goes over. I mean, stand up in your workplace on Monday morning and say, hey, I learned something over the weekend, that women are the weaker vessel. Oof, that won't go over too well. But again, this, as it says at the bottom, this is not a term of inferiority, but a realization that men are typically physically stronger. And so a husband who desires to please the Lord will be sensitive to, rather than exploit or demean, his wife's weakness and treasure her as a unique creation of God. And so husbands, just like I challenge you to have a conversation about what practical acts of love look like, I would encourage you to give some consideration to what practical ways you might be able to keep learning about your wife. Thirdly, then, not only are we called by God to love and to learn, we are called to lead. And we could talk all day about leadership and what leadership in the home is and is not. I was a youth pastor for quite a while when I lived in the States, and one of my responsibilities as a youth pastor was teaching Bible in a Christian school that we had connected to our church. And I distinctly remember, this is early on, I was young, I was like in my early 20s. I had really no clue what I was doing. That's just the reality. But here I am teaching, I think at that point the 9th graders, grade 9 in the United States. And in this particular class, it was dominated by very, very strong girls. Like, not physically strong, but just strong. Like, I don't know, they dominated the guys. I mean, it was like the opposite of Genesis 3, right? Big personalities, just bombastic, and talk and speak their mind. Somehow, in this particular class, we got onto the subject of marriage, and we were talking about husbands being given the responsibility to lead, and this one girl in particular who was always kind of contrary. You know, raised her hand and said, I don't think it's fair that men get to lead. I'm like, okay, what do I do with this? And so I maybe this wasn't a spirit-inspired answer, but this is what came to my mind, so I said it. I said, well, if leadership is such the desired role in the marriage relationship, then why is it that most men don't do it? I don't know where that came from. It just came out. That's what I said. And I actually happen to believe that. Having watched a lot of marriage relationships for a long time, I happen to believe that a lot of men don't lead. They just don't lead. Very passive. I think I actually make this point here in your notes. Well, if you look next to number 1.3, God instructed the man to take the initiative in leaving his home and holding fast to his wife. It's evident from the beginning that God designated the man as the head of the wife. Part of the tragedy of Genesis 3 is Adam's failure to exercise his God-given leadership role to protect and to direct Eve in the moment of their temptation. I believe that about Genesis 3. So leadership sounds really cool, like, oh, I'm in a position of authority and people have to listen to me. Well, that's not what we're talking about with leadership, for one thing. And secondly, it's not as easy as it sounds. As it says underneath number 3 there, leadership is not as easy as it seems. There are many self-centered, sinful demonstrations of leadership in our world, and I'm sure you've seen some of these things. Some people use their leadership position to get other people to do what they want. Some people view leadership as a permission to be harsh, to be critical, to be insensitive. Some husbands view their homes as a place to be served. And some leaders, some people in positions of leadership just remain aloof and distant and unapproachable to the people that they are leading. I'm sure you've seen those demonstrations of leadership. They're not really demonstrations of leadership. It's not true leadership. But that's how a lot of people function. Look at the next point. Jesus' model of leadership is a radical departure from the world's pattern of leadership. According to Jesus, great leaders in the kingdom of God are distinguished by their willingness to do what? To serve. Not to be served, right? He said, I did not come to be served, but to serve and to give my life as a ransom for many. And so great leaders in the kingdom of God don't care about appearance. They're concerned about meeting the needs of other people. If you want to see one of the best illustrations of leadership, read John chapter 13. Jesus, just within hours of being handed over to first the religious leaders of his day and then to Roman authorities, did something that Jewish rabbis never did. He got a towel out and he bent over and he washed the feet of his disciples, including Judas Iscariot. That is a picture and a model of true leadership. And that doesn't mean that you have to do everything in your home. It means certainly that you're willing to do whatever it takes that's necessary for the benefit and the blessing of the people in your home. But it does mean that you are not looking to hold on to position and to hold that over the people around you and say, listen to me, I'm in charge around here. That is not biblical leadership. Leaders are marked by their willingness to serve. And then the next statement says this: a balanced servant, leader, husband is noted for genuine interest in his wife's opinions and input, valuing each contribution that she makes for decisions that must be made, but also a willingness to make decisions, embracing the pressure of leadership along with the privileges. And here's a quote that I think helps in this. In the partnership of two spiritually equal human beings. You see that equality thing going on again there? This is not about value, it's about function. In the partnership of two spiritually equal human beings, man and woman, the man bears the primary responsibility to lead the partnership in a God-glorifying direction. That is a biblical understanding of what it means to lead. And that is a biblical understanding of the role of a husband. Love, learn, and lead. And understand that, I don't want to be like super pedantic about this, but I do think there's a natural order to this to some degree. The first two will help with the third. If all you're focused on is this, and you don't really care about this or this, guess what? This is going to be bad. It's going to be really bad. This needs to be informed by how you love and how you learn. So, husbands, strengthening your marriage discussion. If you want to know how you're doing in these areas, ask your wife for some loving, honest discussion about how you love, how you learn, and how you lead. And I'll make myself available tomorrow after church for counseling for you after you have that honest conversation. I'm just kidding. I'm sure you're all doing way better than you think you are. Ladies, let's turn quickly to you. You'll be thankful, ladies, yours is much shorter than the men. And I'll be much nicer to you than I am to the men. I can be mean to the guys because I'm a guy. So, role and responsibility of the wife. The original design of the woman was to be a helper fit for him. We read that passage in Genesis 2, right? And that's the phrase that God used to describe Eve, a helper fit for him. So her primary role is to be a complementing completer to her husband. She's also been given the opportunity, or the responsibility rather, by God to submit to her husband and to respect him. So let's talk first of all about this idea of complementing completer. If you're looking for the words that go in the blanks there, the wife is created by God to be a complement. Notice that's complement with an E in the middle, not an I. If it had an I in the middle, that would be that you have to say some really nice things about your husband all the time. That's a compliment. This compliment is to come alongside and assist and help compliment. To be a complement to her husband, to be a helper, and to complete her husband. Because it was not good for the man to be alone. And so it says underneath that first point there, consistent with creation order, the woman was created as a helper fit for her husband. Literally, she was made to be a help. The word help has the idea of aid or support, and the word fit has the idea of opposite part or corresponding to the other side. And so in other words, she was made to support man's other side. And immediately in our culture, people see that and they say that is so demeaning to women. Actually, I want to suggest to you that that's exalting. If you look at this, look at the next statement in your notes. It is not a demeaning term in any way. It is often used of God in his relationship to Israel. Did you ever know that? God speaks of himself this way in his relationship to his people. And so lest you think that it's demeaning for God to call a woman a helper fit, remember, he's putting you in the same category as himself in his relationship to his people. This term fit suggests that she would not be inferior, but rather share his nature. And again, I point you back to Genesis 2, verse 23. When Adam saw Eve for the first time, he did not say, oh, here's the person that I get to suppress. Here's the person that I get to lead. He said, wow, this is flesh of my flesh, bone of my bones. I've heard somebody once say jokingly, and I think it's kind of funny, his name was Man. When he saw Eve for the first time, he said, "Whoa, man." And that's where we get woman from, right? He was impressed. He did not view this as somebody that he could put underneath his thumb. He looked at her as somebody who was sharing in his nature. And so, ladies, I would just say for your own consideration, think about in what ways the wife could help her husband. Next statement there at the bottom, God said that it was not good that man would be alone. He was incomplete without someone like him. So that Hebrew word again for help has the idea of active intervention on behalf of someone, or to provide what someone is lacking. In other words, the wife completes her husband. She provides what he is lacking on his own. So the wife must recognize that her perspective and opinion add valuable insight for a wise husband who desires to lead in a way that pleases the Lord. Her insight completes what is lacking in her perspective alone. That's the idea of a complementing completer. Secondly, this is where we move into even more dangerous territory. A wife is called by God to submit to her husband's leadership and to respect him. Now, I'm going to say this right off the bat just to calm everybody's heart here. I will be the first one to admit that these words and these terms have been used and abused by many a husband. Okay? Nobody is suggesting that that has never happened. But the fact that that has happened is not God's fault, for one. And secondly, the fact that people have used and abused, misused these terms doesn't mean that it's no longer necessary. What's necessary is that we understand what they truly mean and that we practice them the way God intended for them to be practiced, not just throw them out the window because they've been misused or because the society says it doesn't need to be that way anymore. Okay? So what do these words mean? Well, we can only say so much about them, but God's administrative order for the home is for the wife to be submissive to the loving leadership of her husband. Emphasis on loving leadership. This is a voluntary decision. Just like love is in the form of a command, so submit is in the form of a command. It's a voluntary decision to order her life under the arrangement that God has designed. So if we want to define submission, let's define it this way. It means arranging oneself in rank underneath. And so it has to do with administrative order, not value. See, I've already heard you say that, Troy. I know, but I got to keep saying it because it's important to realize that we are not talking about value. We are talking about functionality. We are talking about administrative order. Contrary to the misrepresentation of submission by our secular culture, biblical submission in no way implies the inferiority of the wife, the infallibility of the husband. God did not put husbands in positions of leadership because they get it right all the time. It's just not true. It does not mean the inability to achieve outside of the home or the inability to have influence on her husband. Actually, the most influential human being in my life ought to be who? My wife. That should be true. Biblically speaking, submission is simply a divine plan for function and order in the home. The submission of the wife to the husband pictures the obedience of the church to Christ. Submission is actually a way of life for all believers. Did you know that? Before Paul says in Ephesians 5, verse 22, wives submit to your own husbands, he says in verse 25, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. There's supposed to be some mutual submission going on in certainly the body of Christ, but I would say also in the home. Practically, this means that when a decision is made by her husband, a wife is called to place herself under his leadership in her life. Now, I will also give this one caveat. Obviously, if a husband ever asked a wife to do something that was in direct disobedience to a revealed command of God, then a wife would not have to place herself underneath that, correct? I mean, if the husband said, I think it'd be a good idea if we went to the store today and we just took a few things off the shelf and walked out of the store and didn't pay for them. And I want you to do that. Wait. No. We know that stealing is a sin. So if the husband ever asked the wife to steal for some reason, she would have a God-given right to say, no, I'm not going to submit myself to that instruction. That's not what we're talking. We're talking about normal day-to-day life. Place yourself under his leadership. And I would just say to you, ladies, an important passage for personal study, for personal consideration, and for seeking God's wisdom in how to live out biblical submission would be 1 Peter 3, 1 through 6. That passage in and of itself is a lot to think through. I wish we had time to go through it. We don't, so you're going to have to kind of wrestle with what's going on there in 1 Peter chapter 3 for now. That's submission. What about respect? Well, I think it's interesting that in Ephesians chapter 5, initially the command given to the wife is to submit, and at the end of Ephesians chapter 5, the command is for the wife to respect. So I think, to some degree, Paul is viewing these two words as being very interrelated to one another, almost being able to be used interchangeably. Not exactly the same thing, but he is sort of using them interchangeably to some degree. However, it's a different word. It's this word phobia. You've heard that word before. So the command for the wife to respect is not a respect granted once it's earned. It's a respect granted voluntarily due to someone's position, in this case the husband's position as the head of the home as designated by God. When a husband is not acting respectably, a wife can still offer respect by how she communicates and by how she cares for him personally and physically. Respect is the recognition by a wife that she belongs to an authority structure ordained by God, and therefore she responds to his God-given role as a leader. And so, another strengthening your marriage discussion, ladies, if you want to know how you're doing in these areas, ask your husband for his loving, honest perspective on how you relate to him in the area of biblical submission and respect. This conclusion, to me, I would encourage you to mark a few things here, because as I was having a conversation briefly with Zonder at the break, and something in our conversation was sort of directed in this vein. As a final thought, it's important to recognize that while God has established clear guidelines and expectations for both the husband and the wife, it is never the responsibility of either to force their spouse to fulfill their roles and responsibilities. Please hear that. Please hear that. God never told me to get my wife to submit to me or to respect me, right? That's not what he told me to do. What did he tell me to do? Love, learn, and lead. That's my responsibility. It's not my wife's job to make me love her. She can't. That's not her role. So it's never the responsibility of either to force their spouse to fulfill their roles and responsibilities. Because we continue to battle our sin, None of us will fulfill our God-given role perfectly or completely. When the husband or the wife fails to fulfill their role, there ought to be spirit-controlled conversation about it, but God did not give you the role or the responsibility of getting your spouse to fulfill his or her role. Your obedience to God in the areas of your role and responsibility does not depend on the obedience of your spouse. So God has called you to do what he has called you to do, and to leave your spouse to him. And so once again, as I said in the last session, I would say this when it comes to the roles and responsibilities. The place to begin is with yourself, not with your spouse. And as part of a good discussion, discuss the challenges that you see in your marriage with regard to fulfilling God's role, expectations for your marriage. In light of the suggestion, here's what I want to encourage you to do. I'm going to give you till 20 after 11. If you are here with your spouse, why don't you find 5 minutes outside, in here, whatever is comfortable, and you're not going to be able to tackle all of these things, but how about a short conversation about one of the things that I've suggested? I'm not making you do this. You can do this if you would like to do this, and then go get another snack, and then at 20 minutes after 11, we'll come back in here, and I'll make sure we get you out of here by noon. Okay? Thank you.